Hello and welcome to the Norfolk Chamber of Commerce GDPR podcast. New rules, known as the European General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, are coming into force in May, which will affect how every business deals with data affecting their employees and customers. But what are these rules, and crucially, how will they affect you and your business? I'm Shaun Lowthorpe, a business journalist, and in this podcast we're looking at the legal framework of the regulations, as well as discussing what steps businesses need to take to make sure they're compliant with the new laws. And joining me to discuss this are Alex Saunders, a solicitor at Leathes, and John Gostling, Managing Director of Breakwater IT. Thanks both for joining us. Alex, I'm going to start with you, if I may. Let's kind of just look at where we are with the current data protection rules and regulations, and then see how it will be different under GDPR. So what's the current status of play?
So the current regulatory framework in this area is called the Data Protection Act 1998, which has actually been around for almost 20 years. It was brought into force in July 1998. And therefore, this framework has been around for a while. And there is a lot of continuity between what currently exists. So there are data protection principles that go right to the core of the Data Protection Act and have been around for the last 20 years. Yeah. Those principles are, in many respects, remaining the same under the GDPR.
So what are those principles?
So those principles are that data needs to be processed fairly and lawfully. Data held cannot be excessive. It needs to be accurate.
Okay.
You can only retain data for so long as is reasonably necessary.
Yeah.
You need to use it for a specific purpose. There are also certain rules around transferring data.
Yeah.
So they're kind of the key things that everyone's talking about under the GDPR, but actually have been around for quite some time.
So if we look at the GDPR then, what's different about these rules compared to what we've currently got, apart from the fact, I guess, we live in a world now where, there's more sharing of information, there's social media, there's, even, how do these new rules differ?
Well, there are some fundamental changes, but they're, in my mind, updates rather than a complete overhaul of the Data Protection Act. So, for example, there's now a principle requiring all businesses to take account of the data that they process. So there's a real drive towards an emphasis towards accountability, which never really existed before. And it's this European premise of sort of almost a risk-based compliance that wasn't a requirement under the Data Protection Act. It means that businesses need to go one step further rather than just saying, yes, we comply with data protection, that's all fine. You actually need to go one step further and show how you're doing it, meaning that things like internal policy documents, procedures, those types of things are now a requirement rather than just previously best practice. So there are some fairly fundamental changes, and there are also fundamental changes in regards to the rights that individuals have. Individuals now have much greater rights than they did under the Data Protection Act, as well as retaining those that they already had and
John,
probably didn't know about.
So, John, your understanding then of how the framework is different. Do you see it as an evolution, as Alex said, or do you see it as a bit more fundamental than that?
No, I see it as an evolution as well. I think, like Alex said, it was written before commercial broadband, when we were all on dial-up, when you might have had a little bit of data in a system, but a lot of paper. Although I'm not really sure, Alex, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that the paper is still accountable under the GDPR.
Yeah, in most cases.
Yeah, but there's so much more data now. People hold so much more data on systems. If you go online to social media, there's so much more information held about you than ever would have been back then. So it is more of an evolution in my mind as well.
And not only that, but you touched on this, Alex, didn't you? When you said that this has sort of really been driven through Europe, if you like. Not only do we hold more data, we hold it sometimes with people who are in different countries even.
That's absolutely right. This exercise of introducing the GDPR is all about the EU pulling together a single harmonious digital market, because data is being transferred all over the place. Lots of clients, I'm sure, have services or data held on Amazon Web Services, for example, cloud service providers. So you're absolutely right. Sometimes businesses don't actually know where their data is held in the first place.
We're leaving the European Union, though, aren't we? So why are we signing up to these rules?
That's a very good question, and probably the one that I get asked the most. I suppose the first thing to say is that Brexit is not really going to make any difference to any of this.
Really?
Certainly in the short to medium term, absolutely right. Because of two things. Firstly, we'll still be a member state by the time it comes into force on the 25th of May.
Okay.
And secondly, it's currently going through the Houses of Parliament to implement it as UK domestic legislation anyway.
Right.
So those two things combined means that we are going to, certainly in the short to medium term, this is just going to be the norm. But there's the other reason, which is, of course, if we want to continue trading with Europe on the terms that we do at the moment,
So
then
regulatory alignment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to ensure that we've got, that level of protection of personal data as compared to our European partners.
What about you hear these sort of phrases about safe harbour legislation being bandied about? I mean, is that what we're also talking about here? I mean, I know we hear about that particularly in terms of US or non-European countries. Does that apply within these rules?
It certainly plays into them. So obviously, between the EU and the US, there's something called the Privacy Shield, which is a framework that effectively the EU have said we're comfortable that the US have sufficient protection in place, and we're comfortable that their level of data protection is on par with ours. There are some specific rules around transferring outside of the European Economic Area, but certainly transfers to the US would be better than transfers to some other countries that don't have that framework in place.
I guess if you've got something like software as a service, though, John, I mean that could be quite difficult to police, couldn't it? I mean, it's we don't have these kind of easily defined borders, do we?
No, well, the internet doesn't have any borders, really, does it? So, no, I still think it's the case that even if you do go out of a geographic region, I still think if you're a company in the US and you're processing data on behalf of an individual in the EU, you still have to comply with the GDPR. So it's still wide-ranging, even if you are a US company.
Yeah.
You still have to be aware of it.
So who has to check that? Is that us as the UK company, or is it the US company? I mean, where's responsibility lie here?
So responsibility lines with what's called the data controller,
Okay.
or the controller under the GDPR, which is a slightly complicated area, but in most cases is the owner of that data.
Yeah.
They're the ones who are responsible for it under the GDPR. So they need to check. So to look at their supply chain, where is our data going? Is it going across borders? And if it's going across borders, where's it going? And as part of what we've been doing, we've been advising clients to look at that supply chain. I know that there are certain providers such as Dropbox who have recently moved their service from the US to the European Economic Area to cover off exactly this type of thing. Obviously, in the case of Breakwater IT, you've got a service provider there in the UK, which goes even one step further and actually gives that level of security. So it's the controller's responsibility.
And is that the kind of sort of audit that you've been doing, actually, both as a business and for your clients, John, that kind of looking at the supply chain?
Yeah, so when you choose some software as a service or a cloud provider like Amazon or Microsoft, you need to look at where they're going to store and where they're going to process that data. Most of them size companies have data centres within the EU.
Yeah.
I don't think AWS or Amazon have data centres in the UK, but Microsoft have Azure data centres in the UK as well, so you can choose to bring stuff into the UK if you want. But ultimately, you can house stuff in Frankfurt, you can house it in Dublin, Amsterdam, all over the EU. So it is really down to picking your supplier and asking them questions.
And does that include social media? Because a lot of businesses are using, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. Are they looking at that as well?
Not in my experience. I don't think people are really looking at that, and I really actually don't know where, say, a lot of LinkedIn or Facebook servers will be held. I know some of them maybe even on AWS servers, but I doubt they're in the EU.
But really, though, if you're a business in Norfolk and you might be using WeTransfer, Dropbox, Office 365, are you really saying that actually you really need to look at all of that for this? Because most people would just you download the software, away you go. Terms and conditions. Oh yeah, I'll click that one. You don't even think about it, do you?
That's my problem with the internet. That people have a trust of the internet. Oh,
Yeah.
I'll just sign up to this service. Tick, tick, tick. I don't really care where it's gone. People don't think, and I think that's one of the good things that could be coming out of things like the GDPR and a lot of cybersecurity recently is that people are actually starting to think when they're hitting that button, where is this information actually going, and where is it going to be stored?
Because presumably, if you don't think about it, you could be fined. Is that right, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of those principles that I talked about to start with is security and having adequate technical and security measures in place. And if you fail to do so, then you are exposed to one of those fines that we've been hearing so much about.
Can we just talk about liability as well? Because we're sort of leading into that. Where does liability rest then in terms of making sure you're compliant? So, for example, if you're an employer, is it with you as the employer? Is it with your staff? And how can you ensure that your business is compliant?
It will be with the organisation.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be personally on the employees. But obviously, I'm sure we've talked about and heard lots about the fines, but they're fairly eye-watering.
Yeah, well, just explain that.
Absolutely. So there's 2 tiers of fines. The first tier is up to 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover, whichever is the greater figure. So you're looking at the best part of 18 million quid there. And that's reserved for breaches of those principles that we talked about.
Yeah.
And there's breaching the rules around, for example, transferring data outside of the European Economic Area where you shouldn't have been. That's where that first tier will really apply. There's then a second tier, and the figures are still fairly eye-watering. It's up to 10 million euros or 2% of global turnover, again, whichever is the greater.
But those numbers, though, that you're talking about, I mean, I'd listen and think, well, they're really just talking about big global corporate businesses, aren't they?
And I would be inclined to agree. And actually, John, I don't know if you've seen this, but the ICO have literally been going out of their way in all the talks they've been doing to make it clear that they are not intending to lump small to medium-sized businesses with that sort of fine. It would never be in public policy or public interest, and they have really actually been going out of their way to say that. So I don't think we will see a situation where those 10, 20 million euro fines are being handed out. But to put it in the context of the existing fining powers, which are 500,000, clearly the ICO, which is the organisation who are responsible for enforcing all of this, clearly the ICO can go much further if they feel it's necessary. So, yes, I think those big numbers are going to be reserved for the largest corporates. And
as a business, you've been sort of advising employers that they need to look at this in terms of their employment contracts. I mean, I think you're even looking at, particularly terms and conditions that they can insert into their employment contracts just to make sure that they're covered. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. Employment contracts are not just employment contracts, but, terms and conditions for, supply of goods and services, looking at your internal policy documents that we talked about earlier. So it's all of those things that you need to consider. A lot of the GDPR is, in many ways, a bit of a paperwork exercise, and it all goes back to this point of accountability, because if the ICO come knocking on your door, then if you don't have those policy documents, if you don't have the right terms in your terms and conditions, you are going to struggle to say that you're complying.
And can businesses insure themselves against this? I mean, they get public liability insurance. Could we have a GDPR data breach liability insurance or something like that?
That's a good question. I've seen cyber security insurance before, John. I don't know if you know any more about that.
Yeah, we've seen cyber security insurance. The biggest difference between that and, say, your standard indemnity insurance, from what I understand, I'm no insurance expert, is that it really covers you for the initial incident. So you can, they if you do have a breach, they will send in a team to help you with that breach. They will help you with your PR and marketing and getting the right message out. And so kind of covering that before, if you have if you have your home broken into, you're not going to have anyone there straight away. It might take a little while for you to have boots on the ground helping you out. And that's what the cyber security insurance generally does. You have very, very early help.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about breaches there. I mean, the way that the legislation is framed, and is the emphasis not so much on the actual breach itself, but making sure you notify people of the breach? Is that what you're actually going to get punished for if you don't do it?
That's spot on, yeah. The two big questions around breaches that you need to know are, firstly, what constitutes a data breach, and then secondly, and most importantly, as you rightly say, what you need to do about it.
Okay.
So there are new reporting guidelines and requirements under the GDPR that never really existed before. Yeah. Without going into too much detail, there may be circumstances where you need to notify the ICO. There may be circumstances where you actually need to notify the individuals themselves, which is obviously going to be even more onerous, particularly if it's a big data breach. And for the first time, the data processor may need to notify the data controller. So when I'm talking about those two roles, I'm talking...
So hang on a second. So we've got the data controller, who's the person that owns the information. The processor is the company that's... Well, that would be someone like you, would it, John?
We don't actually process
Right,
data,
okay,
but say someone who runs a software as a service or a CRM system,
Okay,
if they're
that's the
processing
processor.
data.
Yeah. And is there a time limit as well on the notification of a breach?
So if you need to notify the ICO, then you need to do so without undue delay or but no later than within 72 hours of discovering the breach.
So it's the ICO you need to notify.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
If you need to notify the data subjects, so that's the individuals whose data has been breached, then you need to do so without undue delay, but there isn't a long stop.
And what do? Do you email them or you write to them? Or write a letter?
You pick up the phone, you email them. There aren't any they're not being hugely prescriptive about the ways in which you notify them. But as I mentioned to start with, there is UK legislation being adopted, which is probably going to iron out some of those nitty-gritty details.
There was a report in January from the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport that said that fewer than half of businesses, and charities for that matter, are actually aware of these new laws. I mean, is there a problem here that... you've explained, Alex, the kind of legal framework that people are just in the dark about it, and they think it may be not for them to look at, but for the IT department or the HR department, for example. I mean, is that a concern?
It is a concern, but we have seen that there's been quite a high uptake in, for example, the Norfolk Chamber events has proved to be quite popular, and other events that we've been involved in. So there is a degree of awareness, but I think you're absolutely right. For those people who have heard about it, then they're very interested in finding out more. But there is a large section of businesses out there who have just never even heard about it, and probably think it's someone else's responsibility to do so. So I think there is good awareness, but it could still be much better.
And John, a company like yours, which essentially is people outsource their IT to somebody like you, is there a danger that they might think, well, I've outsourced that, so I don't have to worry about it because that's what I'm paying them to do?
Absolutely, yes, we get that quite a lot. So we will raise the question. Yeah. We'll talk to them about their data, and we'll talk to them about where it is and everything we've already spoken about. But when we go and see new people and we mention it, we quite often have the statement of GDP what. Even we've been to some solicitors who have even said that. But that's what events like the Chamber are doing. 350 people at a conference, I think, is incredible. And if you'd have put the same conference on 2 years ago, you wouldn't have had 20 people there.
OK, so we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. So my thanks to Alex Saunders from Leathes Prior and John Gostling from Breakwater IT for joining us. And thank you too for listening. Now, don't forget, if you're interested in more details or resources about this and other topics, then you can go to the Norfolk Chamber website.
This was a Tin Can Digital production for the Norfolk Chamber of Commerce, produced by Fiona, Ryder and presented by Shaun Lowthorpe.